My name is Eli Mercer, and I used to believe marriage was about partnership. That was before I discovered my wife Vivienne had redefined our relationship as a hostile corporate takeover. It started with insomnia. 3 months of lying awake while she came home later and later, smelling like expensive cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about her evening, she'd flash that practiced PR smile and say something about client dinners or strategy sessions. "You wouldn't understand, Eli," she'd say, hanging her blazer in our walk-in closet with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed the motion. "Marketing isn't like your little consulting firm. Real business happens after hours." Real business. The phrase stung because she knew it would. My consulting firm employed 12 people and had been profitable for 8 years, but Vivienne had a talent for making success feel like failure. Tonight was different. She stumbled through our front door at nearly midnight, her usually perfect auburn hair slightly mussed, lipstick gone. The smell hit me immediately, not just cologne, but champagne and something else. Satisfaction, maybe. The scent of someone who'd gotten exactly what they wanted. "Late meeting?" I asked from the kitchen island, where I'd been nursing a bourbon and pretending to read industry reports. "Board presentation ran long." She kicked off her heels and padded toward the stairs. Gideon wanted to review the quarterly projections again. Gideon Cross, her boss, the golden boy who'd transformed Morrison & Associates from a mid-tier PR firm into a regional powerhouse. Married to a pharmaceutical heiress, drove a vintage Porsche, and had the kind of confident smile that made other men feel inadequate. "Must have been quite a review," I said. "Your blouse is buttoned wrong." Vivienne's hand flew to her chest. Sure enough, she'd missed a button, creating an uneven line down her silk blouse. For someone who built her career on image management, it was the kind of mistake that revealed everything. "I'm exhausted," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We can talk tomorrow." But we wouldn't talk tomorrow. We hadn't really talked in months. Instead, we'd perform our morning routine: coffee, small talk about schedules, a perfunctory kiss goodbye, while the distance between us grew wider. After she went upstairs, I sat in the dark kitchen, turning her office keycard over in my hands. She'd left it on the counter next to her purse, probably too distracted to notice. Vivienne never forgot details like that. Never. My phone buzzed. A text from Alex, my tech-savvy friend who ran IT support for half the businesses in town. "Still up? Got those camera specs you asked about?" I'd called Alex 3 days ago with a hypothetical question about surveillance equipment. Small, wireless, high definition. The kind of thing a suspicious husband might use to confirm what he already knew. "Hypothetically," Alex had said with a knowing chuckle, "a guy could set up a camera smaller than a thumb drive. Battery lasts 48 hours, streams directly to a smartphone app. Hypothetically speaking, of course." Now, staring at Vivienne's keycard, the hypothetical was becoming very real. The next morning, Vivienne left early for a breakfast meeting. I waited 30 minutes, then drove to Morrison & Associates' downtown office building. The lobby was all glass and polished steel, designed to intimidate clients into believing they were dealing with serious professionals. Mr. Platt, the elderly security guard, barely looked up from his newspaper as I signed the visitor log. I'd been here dozens of times over the years for company parties and client events. Just another spouse dropping by. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Vivienne's office was on the 7th floor, corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Her assistant Janine wasn't at her desk yet. Perfect timing. I used the keycard and slipped inside. The office was vintage Vivienne. Everything white and chrome, motivational quotes in expensive frames, awards lined up like soldiers on her credenza. A photo of us from our wedding sat facing away from her desk, turned toward the wall. The camera Alex had given me was indeed tiny, no bigger than a flash drive. I positioned it on her bookshelf behind a row of business journals, angled toward her desk and the small conference table where she held private meetings. My phone buzzed as I was leaving. Vivienne, forgot my laptop. Can you drop it off on the kitchen counter? I texted back, already heading to your office. Saw it this morning. Her response came quickly. You're the best. Love you. Love you. The words felt hollow, like dialogue from a script she'd memorized, but stopped believing. I spent the rest of the day at my own office, trying to focus on client projects while the camera app ran in the background on my phone. Nothing happened until late afternoon, when motion sensors triggered a notification. The image quality was crystal clear. Vivienne sat at her conference table across from Gideon Cross, papers spread between them. They were leaning close, his hand covering hers. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back in genuine delight, an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Then he leaned over and pressed his lips to hers. Not a quick, impulsive kiss, but something slow and deliberate. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up and touched his face with her free hand. I watched them separate, saw Gideon pour champagne from a bottle that had been sitting in an ice bucket beside the table. They toasted something, her promotion maybe, or their successful deception. The whole scene lasted 12 minutes. When I got home that evening, Vivienne was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, looking relaxed and domestic. The perfect wife. How was your day? She asked, not looking up from the cutting board where she was slicing vegetables. Productive, I said. Landed the Henderson account. That's wonderful, honey. Her enthusiasm sounded genuine, which somehow made it worse. We should celebrate. Already celebrating something else? She paused, knife halfway through a carrot. What do you mean? Nothing. Just wondering about all that champagne you've been drinking lately. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. The footage was still there, saved in high definition. Vivienne and Gideon, the kiss, the champagne, her hand on his face. Interesting meeting today, I said. She turned around, and for just a moment I saw fear flicker across her face. Then the PR training kicked in, and she composed herself. Eli, I can explain. Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty self-explanatory. She set down the knife and moved toward me. It's not what you think. Really? Because I think my wife is having an affair with her boss. I think she's been lying to me for months, and I think she's about to try to convince me that what I saw with my own eyes isn't real. You're right, she said quietly. About all of it. I hadn't expected honesty. It threw me off balance. How long? I asked. 3 months. Do you love him? She hesitated. I don't know. Maybe. It's complicated. Complicated? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's one way to put it. What are you going to do? It was a fair question. The old Eli might have demanded she end it, might have threatened divorce, might have stormed over to Gideon's house for a confrontation. But the old Eli had been naive enough to believe his marriage was real. The new Eli was learning to think strategically. I'm going to finish making dinner, I said, and then I'm going to decide what kind of man I want to be. That night, after Vivienne had gone to bed, I sat in my home office and began planning. Not just revenge. That was too simple, too emotional. What I wanted was justice, the kind that would make them both understand exactly what they'd destroyed and what it was going to cost them. I started with research. Morrison and Associates had a strict policy about workplace relationships, especially between supervisors and subordinates. The employee handbook was clear. Such relationships had to be disclosed to HR within 30 days or face immediate termination. Gideon had been Vivienne's boss for 2 years. If their relationship had begun 3 months ago, they were already in violation. But I needed more than just the video. I needed documentation, witnesses, evidence of how their affair was affecting business decisions. I called Alex. Remember that hypothetical surveillance situation? I said. The one that's not hypothetical anymore? I need to expand the scope. Alex arrived at my office the next morning with a messenger bag full of equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Tiny cameras, audio recording devices, signal boosters, and software that could crack most basic password protections. This is either the beginning of the most elaborate divorce case in Connecticut history, or you're planning to bring down a corrupt PR firm, he said, spreading the devices across my conference table. Why not both? Alex was the kind of friend who asked few questions and provided excellent technical support. We'd known each other since college, where he'd helped me pass computer science courses while I'd helped him navigate social situations. 20 years later, the arrangement still worked. Here's what we can do, he said, pointing to a device no bigger than a coin. Audio pickup with a range of 30 feet. Sticks to any surface, broadcasts to your phone. This one, he held up something that looked like a pen, is a keylogger. Plug it into any USB port for 10 seconds, and it records every keystroke on that computer for the next month. What about email monitoring? Trickier, but not impossible. If you can get me 5 minutes with her laptop, I can install software that forwards copies of all incoming and outgoing messages to a dummy account. The plan was taking shape. Over the next week, I would build a comprehensive picture of Vivienne and Gideon's relationship. Not just the romantic aspects, but the professional implications. How were their personal feelings affecting business decisions? Were they sharing confidential information? Were other employees being passed over for opportunities because of favoritism? One more thing, Alex said. You need to be careful about legal boundaries. Everything we're doing exists in a gray area. Make sure you can justify it if this ends up in court. That afternoon, I drove to Morrison & Associates again. This time, I had a legitimate reason for the visit. Vivienne had invited me to the company's monthly happy hour. She'd been making an effort to include me in her work life lately, probably feeling guilty about the affair. The office was buzzing with employees gathered around a makeshift bar in the main conference room. I recognized most faces from previous events, but I was looking for someone specific. Janine, Vivienne's assistant. I found her by the windows, nursing a glass of wine and looking uncomfortable. Janine was in her late 20s, efficient and observant. More importantly, she'd always seemed to genuinely like me, often commenting on how lucky Vivienne was to have such a supportive husband. "Eli," she said when she saw me, "I was hoping you'd make it tonight. Wouldn't miss it. How are things around here?" "Busy, really busy. Vivienne and Mr. Cross have been working on some big project together. Lots of closed-door meetings, weekend work sessions." She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I think the other senior associates are getting a little frustrated with how much attention that account is getting." "What kind of account requires that much personal attention?" Janine glanced around, then leaned closer. "That's just it. I don't think it's really about an account. I've been scheduling these meetings for weeks, but there's never any client correspondence, no project files, no deliverables. Just the two of them, locked in her office or the conference room for hours." This was exactly what I needed. An inside perspective from someone who was already suspicious. "That does seem odd," I said carefully. "And expensive. All those dinners they're charging to the company account? The weekend hotel stays for strategy sessions? I process the expense reports, Eli. I know what client work looks like, and this isn't it." Hotel stays. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sure there's an explanation." "Maybe. But if I were a partner in this firm, I'd want to know why 2 employees are spending company money on what looks like personal time." I excused myself and found a quiet corner to text Alex. "Need that keylogger tonight, and we're going to need financial records." The happy hour wound down around 7. Vivienne was deep in conversation with Gideon and several other senior associates, so I approached her desk area. Janine had left her computer unlocked, a stroke of luck. I plugged in Alex's keylogger device, counted to 10, then removed it. The entire process took less than 15 seconds. Next, I needed access to Vivienne's laptop. She'd left it in her office, but the door was locked. However, her keycard was clipped to her purse, which she'd left on Janine's desk. I borrowed the card, slipped into Vivienne's office, and connected Alex's USB device to her laptop. The software installation was automatic. 30 seconds, and every email she sent or received would be copied to an account Alex had created. On my way out, I placed one of the audio devices under her conference table and another behind the picture frame on her desk. By the time I rejoined the party, I had comprehensive surveillance coverage of Vivienne's workspace. "There you are," Vivienne said, appearing at my elbow with a glass of wine. "I was wondering where you'd disappeared to." "Just admiring your office setup. Very professional." "Thank you. I've worked hard to create the right environment." She paused, studying my face. "You seem different lately. More engaged. Maybe I'm finally understanding what real business looks like." She smiled, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm glad. I want you to be proud of what I've accomplished here." "Oh, I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to your accomplishments." That night, I set up monitoring stations in my home office. 3 different apps on my phone and laptop, each connected to a different surveillance device. Audio from her office and conference room, video from the bookshelf camera, and keystroke logging from her computer. The first major breakthrough came 2 days later. I was reviewing audio recordings when I heard Vivienne's voice, slightly muffled but clearly audible. "We need to be more careful. Eli's been asking questions." Gideon's response was equally clear. "What kind of questions?" "About the late nights, the meetings. He's not stupid, Gideon. He knows something's different." "Are you worried he suspects about us?" "I think he might. Yesterday he made some comment about champagne. We had champagne in my office on Tuesday. How could he possibly know that?" There was a long pause. Then Vivienne's voice, quieter now. "I don't know. But we should probably cool things down for a while." "Vivienne, you know that's not an option. The board meeting is next week. If we're going to announce the merger and your promotion, we need to finalize the Henderson contract first." Henderson contract. That was my client, the account I'd just landed. How did they know about it? "I can handle Eli," Vivienne said, "but you need to be more discreet. No more flowers delivered to the office. No more weekend trips charged to the company account." "Fine. But after the board meeting, things are going to change around here. You'll be a senior partner, and we won't have to sneak around anymore." Senior partner. Vivienne hadn't mentioned anything about a promotion. More importantly, she certainly hadn't mentioned that it was connected to my business. I spent the next hour reviewing keystroke logs from her computer. What I found made my chest tighten with a mixture of rage and admiration for her thoroughness. Vivienne had been systematically accessing my email account. She'd figured out my password months ago and forwarding information about my clients to Gideon. Contract details, pricing strategies, project timelines, everything Morrison and Associates would need to either steal my clients or undercut my proposals. But it went deeper than corporate espionage. She'd been building a case against me, documenting every argument we'd had, every moment of tension in our marriage, screenshots of text messages, recordings of phone calls, even photos of me taken without my knowledge. She was preparing for divorce, and she was planning to destroy me in the process. The final piece of evidence came from her email monitoring, a message to Lila Huxley, her best friend who worked in HR at a competing firm. "Need advice on asset protection strategies. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to ensure their spouse couldn't claim half of future earnings, what would be the best approach? Asking for a friend, obviously. Also, do you know any good private investigators? Same friend might need documentation of erratic behavior patterns." Lila's response was immediate. "Call me tonight. And yes, I know exactly the right PI for this kind of situation. Your friend is smart to plan ahead." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the wall of evidence I'd assembled over the past week. Photos, audio recordings, financial documents, email threads, enough material to destroy both their careers and probably send them to prison for corporate fraud. But simply exposing them wasn't enough anymore. They weren't just having an affair, they were actively working to destroy my business and my life. Vivienne was planning to divorce me, take half of everything I'd built, and leave me with nothing while she started a new life with Gideon. The old Eli would have confronted them directly, maybe hired a lawyer, tried to work through the system. The new Eli was going to teach them that the last real man in this marriage was also the smartest. I started with Janine. She was the perfect inside ally, observant, already suspicious, and increasingly frustrated with being excluded from important decisions. More importantly, she had access to everything: calendars, expense reports, client files, and internal communications. I asked her to meet me for coffee at a place downtown, away from the office. She arrived, looking nervous but curious. "I need to ask you something confidential," I said, once we'd settled into a corner booth. "And I need you to know that whatever you tell me, I'm going to use it to protect both of us." "Protect us from what?" "From what's about to happen at Morrison and Associates. You said yourself that something doesn't feel right about all those private meetings and expense reports. I think you're correct, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better." I showed her printouts of some of the financial irregularities I'd discovered: hotel charges, restaurant bills, travel expenses that didn't correspond to any client work. Nothing that revealed my surveillance methods, just patterns that a careful observer might notice. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "I have my sources. The question is, what are you going to do when HR starts asking questions about expense reports you processed?" Her face went pale. "You think they're going to blame me?" "I think they're going to need someone to blame, and assistants make convenient scapegoats, unless you have documentation proving you were just following orders." That afternoon, Janine began forwarding me copies of every suspicious document that crossed her desk. Meeting schedules, expense reports, internal memos. She was building her own paper trail, but she was also building mine. The next phase required a more delicate touch. I needed to turn Morrison and Associates' own policies against Vivienne and Gideon, but I had to do it in a way that looked like natural consequences rather than orchestrated revenge. I started by anonymously forwarding some of the surveillance footage to the company's HR department. Not the intimate moments, that would have been too obvious, but the professional boundary violations. Vivienne and Gideon alone in her office with the door locked, champagne during work hours, his hand on her shoulder during what was supposed to be a business meeting. The email was simple. "Thought you should be aware of potential policy violations. A concerned employee." Within 2 days, I could see the effects through the office surveillance. HR Director Patricia Manning visited Vivienne's office for a 30-minute closed-door conversation. Afterward, Vivienne called Gideon immediately. "We have a problem." Her voice came through clearly on the audio feed. "Patricia got an anonymous tip about our relationship." "What kind of tip?" "Someone sent photos. Nothing explicit, but enough to raise questions about workplace appropriateness." "Do you think it was Eli?" "I don't know how it could be. He doesn't have access to the office, and these were taken from inside the building." "Then it's someone here, someone who's been watching us." I could hear the paranoia creeping into their voices. Good. Paranoid people make mistakes. The next morning, Vivienne was unusually affectionate at breakfast. She sat closer to me than she had in months, touched my arm while talking, even suggested we plan a weekend getaway. "I feel like we've been drifting apart," she said. "Maybe we should see a counselor, work on reconnecting." "That's a great idea," I said. "I think professional guidance could help us understand what's really going on in our relationship." She smiled, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was trying to manage the situation, control the narrative. If she could present herself as the loving wife working to save her marriage, It would be harder for anyone to believe she was having an affair. But I had other plans. That evening, I called Stacy, the bartender at Riverside Grill, where Morrison and Associates held most of their client dinners. Stacy was a gossip who knew everyone's business and loved sharing information with the right audience. "Eli, haven't seen you in a while. How's Vivienne?" That's actually what I wanted to talk about. She's been working so hard lately, all these late client dinners. I was thinking of surprising her one night, maybe sending over champagne or flowers. Can you tell me which nights she's usually there? Oh, honey, she's here at least twice a week. Always with that handsome boss of hers, Mr. Cross. They sit at table 12, the corner booth, always request the same server. Very cozy, if you know what I mean. Cozy how? Let's just say they're very attentive to each other. Lots of hand-holding, intimate conversation. The kind of attention that makes other diners notice. Perfect. Public witnesses to their relationship. Has anyone else noticed? Are you kidding? Half the business community eats here. Everyone's talking about it. Some people think it's romantic, others think it's unprofessional. Depends on your perspective, I guess. I thanked Stacy and hung up. The affair was already public knowledge in their professional circle. All I had to do was make sure the right people started asking the right questions. I spent the weekend crafting anonymous emails to 3 key targets: the senior partners at Morrison and Associates, the board members of the Connecticut Public Relations Association, and the spouses of several major clients. Each email was carefully worded to sound like it came from a concerned observer rather than a vengeful husband. I included just enough detail to be credible without revealing my sources. To the senior partners, thought you should be aware that 2 of your employees are conducting a very public relationship that's becoming a distraction at client events. Several business owners have mentioned it to me. To the PR association, one of your member firms may have some internal issues that could reflect poorly on the industry. I'd suggest a quiet conversation before it becomes a bigger problem. To the client spouses, you might want to ask your husband-wife about the dinner meetings they've been attending. The atmosphere at these events isn't as professional as they might be claiming. By Monday morning, the pressure was building from multiple directions. I could see it in Vivienne's behavior. She was checking her phone constantly, taking calls in private, and asking me strange questions about my schedule and activities. The breakthrough came Tuesday afternoon. Janine forwarded me an email from Patricia Manning to all senior staff. Effective immediately, all employee relationships must be disclosed to HR within 48 hours. This policy applies retroactively to any existing relationships. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination. Vivienne and Gideon were trapped. They could disclose their relationship and face the professional consequences, or they could continue hiding it and risk losing their jobs entirely. That evening, Vivienne came home early and found me in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "We need to talk," she said. "About what?" "About us. About what you know, what you think you know, and what you're planning to do about it." I set down my knife and turned to face her. "What do you think I know?" "I think you know about Gideon. I think you've known for a while. And I think you're the one who's been causing problems at my office." "What kind of problems?" "Anonymous tips to HR, questions from clients. Suddenly everyone's paying attention to my personal life. That doesn't happen by accident." I leaned against the counter and studied her face. She looked tired, stressed, but also defiant, still fighting. "You're right," I said. "I know about Gideon. I know about the hotel rooms, the expense account fraud, the stolen client information. I know about your divorce planning and your asset protection strategies. I know about all of it." Her composure cracked slightly. "How?" "Does it matter? The question is, what happens next? What do you want?" "I want you to understand something, Vivienne. You thought you were playing chess while I was playing checkers. You thought you could manipulate me, steal from me, plan to destroy me, and I'd never figure it out." I moved closer, and she took a step back. But here's what you didn't consider. I've been watching you build your career for 15 years. I know how you think, how you plan, how you execute, and I'm better at it than you are. Eli, we can work this out. We can— No, I said quietly. We can't. Because this isn't about the affair anymore. This is about the fact that you've been systematically destroying my business while planning to destroy my life. This is about the fact that you're not just unfaithful, you're a criminal. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went white. What is it? I asked. Gideon, the board wants to see both of us tomorrow morning. Emergency meeting. I smiled. Well then, I guess you'd better get your story straight. That night, I lay awake listening to Vivienne make frantic phone calls from the guest bedroom. She was calling Lila, calling lawyers, calling anyone who might help her manage the crisis. But it was too late for crisis management. Tomorrow, the consequences would begin in earnest, and I was just getting started. The emergency board meeting lasted 3 hours. I knew because I was monitoring Vivienne's phone, and she sent periodic updates to Lila throughout the ordeal. They have everything, read one text. Expense reports, photos, witness statements. Someone's been building a case for weeks. Can you prove it was Eli? Lila responded. How could it be? He doesn't have access to internal documents or surveillance footage. This had to come from inside the company. I smiled, reading the exchange from my office. Let them wonder. Paranoia was more destructive than certainty. The outcome was predictable. Both Vivienne and Gideon were suspended pending a full investigation. Their company credit cards were canceled, their access to client accounts was revoked, and they were banned from the office until further notice. But the real damage was just beginning. That afternoon, I received a call from Tom Henderson, the client whose contract had been at the center of their scheme. Eli, I just got a very interesting phone call from Morrison and Associates. Apparently, there's been some kind of internal security breach, and they're concerned that confidential information about our project might have been compromised. What kind of information? The details of our contract with you, pricing, timeline, deliverables. They're suggesting we might want to review our vendor relationships to ensure there are no conflicts of interest. I let that sink in. Morrison and Associates was trying to get ahead of the scandal by suggesting that I was the security risk. Tom, I think you should know that my wife works for Morrison and Associates, and I think you should also know that I've discovered evidence suggesting she's been accessing my client files without authorization. There was a long pause. Are you saying she stole information about our project? I'm saying you might want to have your legal team review exactly what Morrison and Associates knew about our contract and how they could have obtained that information. By the end of the week, 3 major clients had terminated their relationships with Morrison and Associates. The scandal was spreading through the business community like wildfire, fueled by gossip from Stacy at Riverside Grill and speculation from other business owners who'd noticed the inappropriate relationship. But Vivienne wasn't going down without a fight. She hired Margaret Torres, one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the state. The strategy became clear immediately. Paint me as an obsessive, controlling husband who'd sabotaged her career out of jealousy. The first salvo came in the form of a restraining order request, claiming I'd been stalking her workplace and harassing her colleagues. The filing included allegations of erratic behavior, obsessive monitoring, and threats of professional retaliation. I had to admire the strategy. If she could convince a judge that I was unstable, it would undermine the credibility of any evidence I'd gathered. But I'd been preparing for this move. Alex had helped me create a comprehensive digital trail showing that all of my information had come from legitimate sources. Janine's forwarded emails, public records, witness statements from restaurant staff, nothing that required illegal surveillance or invasion of privacy. More importantly, I had documentation of Vivienne's own surveillance activities. The keylogger software on my computer, the forwarded emails, the private investigator she'd hired to follow me. If she wanted to claim I was the one engaging in inappropriate monitoring, we could have that conversation in open court. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. I spent the weekend preparing with my own attorney, David Kim, a former prosecutor who specialized in corporate fraud cases. The key, David explained, is to stay focused on the facts. Don't get emotional, don't make it personal, let the evidence speak for itself. What about her claims of harassment and stalking? We'll address those directly. You have witnesses who can testify that you never contacted her workplace inappropriately, never threatened anyone, never engaged in any behavior that could be considered stalking. Meanwhile, we have documentation showing that she was the one engaging in unauthorized surveillance. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. The courthouse was busy with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, and family members dealing with various domestic disputes. Vivienne sat across the courtroom with Margaret Torres, looking professional and composed. She'd chosen her outfit carefully: conservative suit, minimal makeup, the image of a successful woman being persecuted by an unstable spouse. Judge Patricia Hendricks called our case, and Margaret Torres stood to present Vivienne's petition. Your Honor, my client is seeking protection from a pattern of escalating harassment and professional sabotage. Mr. Mercer has been systematically attempting to destroy her career through anonymous complaints, false allegations, and invasive surveillance of her workplace. Torres presented a compelling narrative. The devoted wife whose marriage had deteriorated, the successful professional whose jealous husband couldn't accept her achievements, the victim of an elaborate campaign of revenge disguised as legitimate business concerns. Then David Kim stood for my response. Your Honor, Mr. Mercer is not the perpetrator in this situation, he's the victim. What Mrs. Mercer characterizes as harassment was actually a legitimate investigation into criminal activity that directly affected his business and financial security. David methodically presented the evidence: the stolen client information, the fraudulent expense reports, the undisclosed workplace relationship, the asset hiding strategies. Each piece of documentation was properly sourced and legally obtained, but the most damaging evidence was Vivienne's own surveillance activities. Mrs. Mercer claims to be the victim of inappropriate monitoring, David said, but the evidence shows that she had been systematically spying on her husband for months. She installed keylogger software on his computer, accessed his email accounts without permission, and hired a private investigator to document his activities, all while planning to file for divorce and claim half of his business assets. Judge Hendricks reviewed the documentation carefully. When she looked up, her expression was stern. Mrs. Mercer, these allegations against your husband appear to be contradicted by substantial evidence of your own misconduct. Not only do I see no grounds for a restraining order, but I'm concerned about potential criminal activity that should be referred to the appropriate authorities. The restraining order was denied. Worse, from Vivienne's perspective, the hearing had created a public record of all the evidence against her. By Tuesday morning, the local business journal had picked up the story. The headline read, "PR executive accused of corporate espionage, expense fraud." The article was devastating, quoting court documents and interviewing former clients who'd noticed suspicious patterns in Morrison and Associates' competitive strategies. The reporter had done her homework, connecting Vivienne's access to my client files with several instances where Morrison and Associates had submitted proposals that seemed to anticipate their competitors' strategies. Wednesday brought the next phase of consequences. The Connecticut Attorney General's office announced an investigation into potential corporate fraud at Morrison and Associates. The State Licensing Board for Public Relations Professionals opened their own inquiry. The IRS began reviewing the company's expense reporting practices. Gideon, facing potential criminal charges and the collapse of his professional reputation, made a predictable decision. He threw Vivienne under the bus. His attorney released a statement claiming that Gideon had been manipulated by a subordinate who used their personal relationship to gain access to confidential information and company resources. He was cooperating fully with all investigations and had voluntarily resigned from Morrison and Associates to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Vivienne was now facing the consequences alone. That evening, she came home looking defeated for the first time since this whole situation began. Her perfect composure was gone, replaced by exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "I know you hate me," she said, standing in the doorway of my home office. "And I know I deserve it. But I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I never meant for it to go this far. The thing with Gideon, it started as just excitement. Something different. I wasn't thinking about consequences. And the client information, the expense fraud, the divorce planning." She looked away. "That was later. When I realized how serious it was getting, I panicked. I thought if I could protect myself financially, maybe I could figure out how to fix everything else. By destroying me in the process. I was scared, Eli. I'd built my whole identity around my career, and suddenly I was risking everything for a relationship that might not even last. I thought if I could control the situation, manage all the variables. You thought you could have it all. The affair, the promotion, the divorce settlement, and no consequences." She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I thought I was smarter than everyone else, smarter than you." I leaned back in my chair and looked at her. For a moment, I could see the woman I'd married 15 years ago, before ambition and entitlement had transformed her into someone I didn't recognize. "You were smart, Vivienne, but you made one crucial mistake." "What was that?" "You underestimated the last real man in your life." She wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, some of the old defiance returning. "So, what happens now? You've destroyed my career, my reputation, probably my freedom. Is that enough revenge for you?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our neighborhood. Nice houses, well-maintained lawns, the kind of suburban success we'd both worked to achieve. "This isn't about revenge anymore, Vivienne. This is about consequences. You made choices, and now you get to live with the results. And us? Our marriage? There is no us. There hasn't been for months. You just didn't bother to tell me until I figured it out myself." She stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the guest bedroom door close. The next morning, she was gone. She'd taken her clothes, her personal items, and her laptop. She left the house keys on the kitchen counter, along with a note, "I'm sorry for what I became. You deserved better." I never saw her again. 3 months later, I was sitting in my expanded office, reviewing contracts for 2 new clients who'd come to me specifically because of my reputation for discretion and integrity. The scandal at Morrison and Associates had, ironically, been excellent for my business. Alex knocked on my door and entered with a grin. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing me a newspaper. The headline read, "Former PR executive pleads guilty to corporate fraud charges." The article was brief but comprehensive. Vivienne had accepted a plea deal that included 18 months in minimum security prison, full restitution to Morrison and Associates and affected clients, and 5 years of probation. Gideon had received a similar sentence, though his family's wealth meant the financial penalties were less devastating. Morrison and Associates had been sold to a larger firm after losing 60% of their client base. Most of the employees, including Janine, had found positions elsewhere. "How do you feel?" Alex asked. I considered the question. 3 months ago, I would have expected to feel satisfaction, vindication, maybe even joy at seeing justice served. Instead, I felt something quieter and more complex. "I feel like myself again," I said finally. "The last real man?" I laughed. "Just a man who learned not to let other people define his reality." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the news about Vivienne. Hope you're doing well. Would love to catch up sometime." "Janine," I showed the message to Alex, who raised an eyebrow. Interesting timing. Very interesting. Janine had been instrumental in exposing the fraud at Morrison and Associates, though she'd never known the full extent of my surveillance operation. As far as she knew, she'd been a whistleblower protecting herself from corporate misconduct. Her actions had been brave and principled. She was also intelligent, attractive, and had demonstrated remarkable loyalty under pressure. I typed back, "Would like that. Are you free for dinner this weekend?" Her response was immediate. "Absolutely. I know a great place downtown. Very professional atmosphere." I smiled. After 15 years with someone who'd turned manipulation into an art form, the prospect of spending time with someone genuine was appealing. "New beginning?" Alex asked. "Maybe, or maybe just the next chapter." That evening, I walked through my house now, officially, since the divorce settlement had awarded me full ownership in exchange for waiving any claim to Vivienne's remaining assets. It was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. I'd learned something important over the past 6 months, the difference between being alone and being lonely. Vivienne's betrayal had been devastating, but her absence was actually a relief. No more walking on eggshells, no more wondering what she was really thinking, no more feeling like a supporting character in my own life. I poured myself a bourbon and sat in my home office, looking at the wall where I'd once displayed evidence of corporate fraud and personal betrayal. That wall was empty now, the documents filed away in storage boxes that would probably never be opened again. On my desk was a new photo, me and Alex at a client dinner, both of us laughing at something that had struck us as absurdly funny. It was a good picture, capturing a moment of genuine happiness. My phone rang. The caller ID showed David Kim, my attorney. "Eli, I have some news you might find interesting. Remember that private investigator Vivienne hired to follow you around?" "What about him?" "Turns out he was also working for Gideon, documenting Vivienne's activities. Apparently, Gideon was planning his own exit strategy in case their relationship became a liability." I absorbed this information. Even in their affair, they'd been betraying each other. "There's more," David continued. "The investigator kept copies of everything, including recordings of conversations between Vivienne and Gideon, where they discussed framing you for the corporate espionage. They were planning to claim you'd hacked into Morrison and Associates systems and stolen client information to benefit your own business. But they never followed through with that plan. Because your evidence was too comprehensive and legally obtained, they couldn't make the frame-up stick without exposing their own crimes." After David hung up, I sat in the quiet house and reflected on how close I'd come to being destroyed by people I'd trusted. If I hadn't discovered the affair when I did, if I hadn't been methodical in gathering evidence, if I hadn't stayed one step ahead of their schemes, I could have been the one facing criminal charges. Instead, I was free. Financially secure, professionally respected, and personally liberated from a relationship that had been slowly poisoning my life. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw Janine standing on my front porch, holding a bottle of wine and looking slightly nervous. "I know we said Saturday," she said when I opened the door, "but I was driving by and saw your lights on, and I thought maybe we could just talk, if you're not busy." "I'm not busy," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "And I think talking is exactly what I need right now." She looked around the living room, taking in the changes I'd made since Vivienne left. New furniture, different artwork, a more comfortable and lived-in atmosphere. "It looks good," she said. "It looks like you." "Thank you. Can I pour you a glass of that wine?" "Please." We settled on the couch, and for the first time in months, I found myself in a conversation that felt natural and unguarded. Janine talked about her new job, her plans for the future, her relief at being away from the toxic environment at Morrison and Associates. "I have to ask," she said eventually. "How did you figure it all out? The affair, the fraud, all of it?" I considered how much to tell her. The full truth about the surveillance operation would probably shock her, even though the results had been justified. "I started paying attention," I said finally. "Really paying attention instead of just accepting what I was told. Once you start looking for patterns, they become pretty obvious." "And you never confronted them directly?" "I learned a long time ago that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. Vivienne showed me that she was willing to lie, cheat, and steal to get what she wanted. Confronting her would have just given her a chance to get better at hiding it." Janine nodded thoughtfully. "I admired how calm you stayed through everything. Even when the whole company was falling apart, you never seemed angry or vindictive." "Oh, I was angry. But anger without strategy is just noise. I wanted results, not just emotional satisfaction." "And now? Are you satisfied with the results?" I looked at her, sitting in my living room, genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. No agenda, no manipulation, no calculation. "I'm satisfied that justice was served," I said. "But more than that, I'm satisfied that I know who I am again." For a while there, I was starting to doubt my own perceptions, my own worth. Vivienne was very good at making me feel like I was the problem. "You were never the problem, Eli. Anyone who worked with both of you could see that." We talked until nearly midnight, and when Janine finally left, she paused at the door. "I'm glad you survived all of this," she said, "and I'm glad you came out of it as yourself, not as someone bitter or broken." After she left, I stood in my doorway and looked out at the quiet neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. I was no longer the last real man in a failing marriage. I was simply a man who'd learned to value authenticity over convenience, truth over comfort, and self-respect over false peace. And that, I realized, was exactly who I wanted to be. The story was over. The consequences had been delivered. Justice had been served. Now the real life could begin.